Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy, and this is a special series on how to talk policy and influence people. I'm joined by my friend and the Manager of Young Knocknaheeny, Katherine Harford. Katherine, thank you so much for being with me today.
Okay, Jane, hi.
How are you?
I'm not too bad, thank you. Working from home, so anything might happen here, Jane.
Oh, I know that too. I'm sitting
Some little
downstairs.
people. Yeah.
Little people or husbands or God knows what else.
That's it, yeah.
Katherine, tell me a little bit about yourself and your work at Young Knocknaheeny.
Okay, so I suppose my background is in, well, I've had, I suppose, a very varied history in my career, but I suppose I did a lot of academic study around politics and community development, and I suppose I would align myself most closely with community development work. I've worked in project and as project officers and community development officers as a health worker, community health worker, and I've worked in homeless services and managed a community health project in the north side of Cork. And I've been with Young Knocknaheeny for about the last 5-6 years. And I've worked in Knocknaheeny itself for the last 12 years.
Wow, what a varied career. Very varied.
Yeah. There's a whole other one behind that, but that's for another day.
Yeah. And okay, so can you tell me about some of the services that Young Knocknaheeny provides and why they're important?
Yeah, so I suppose I'll give you a little bit of the history, Jane. Young Knocknaheeny came about because I suppose there were a lot of us working in the area together across different organisations, sectors, and I suppose you could say silos as well. And we were trying to work at a very local level during the last economic recession to try to tease out ways that we could improve the way that we work to improve outcomes for children. I suppose we'd all been working and been witness to that kind of intergenerational cycle of poverty, which repeats itself even in the short time that I've been working. It repeats itself very quickly. And I suppose while everybody is well-meaning, comes into this work to do the very best that they can, you soon become part of that cycle and you witness it, and you can have kind of individual frustrations around that. But while you might see individual, I suppose, successes as well, which you hang on, the kind of systems don't necessarily support that at a wider level. So a lot of us, I'd say there was about 15 or so different services got together to look at different ways of approaching things, and we went around the country, we looked internationally, and we started to develop together about how we would like our community of services with the community itself to organise itself more collectively to improve outcomes for children. And I suppose that is the early inception of the Young Knocknaheeny programme. And if I dig up all the old paperwork to it, we're not actually that dissimilar to what we first envisaged. Very much prevention, early intervention, starting our work in the community around the pre-birth period, supporting children in their earliest development, their relationships in the home, and their interaction with services which are there to support them, all the way into school, so that they can sort of be as ready and as equipped as any child, as all children should be, for their challenges and opportunities in life. And I suppose we encounter families where that is more difficult. Their starting point is not the same as that of all children, you know, as you would expect. So it's that kind of a bit more targeted within a particular area or collection of areas to ensure those children have the same opportunity as anybody else, really.
That's super. Thanks for that, Katherine. You kind of address there what is prevention and early intervention. It's something that I had heard about a bit when I was doing my work at the Irish Penal Reform Trust with CDI Tala. I heard, you know, if we invest money in early childhood and help families and communities be strong and supportive and safe, then we can, you know, offset some of the later life problems that might occur. Why is early intervention and prevention important?
Well, think of it as that kind of, I suppose, that upstream. Think about the stream. So it's starting at the source of the stream. And, you know, yes, there is an economic argument for this. So you are offsetting or buffering from later economic costs to society. If you intervene earlier, you identify problems earlier, and you try to address them early in their kind of manifestation, I suppose. But there's, yes, and you will save a lot of money by doing that, but it isn't a competition with secondary or tertiary or primary services even. It's that bit of infrastructure that's required as a continuum between all of that, so that the targeted end or the specialist end in that kind of pyramid, you know, so that the specialist services or the critical services are there to do exactly what they're designed to do. They're not designed to take the weight of the full needs at a community level or a kind of society level. So you need that earlier intervention to provide all that infrastructure that supports all this continuum of services all the way up, so that they can be drawn upon in a timely and effective way when they are required themselves. So yes, there is an economic argument. I think there's a systems argument. I think there's two other arguments for prevention and early intervention. One is that, I suppose, children's lives are lived now, not because they're economically beneficial for the future. You know, we need to support children at the time in their lives for their growth and development, which is age appropriate or needs appropriate or developmentally appropriate at that point. That's the case to be made, not waiting till they're in school or waiting till later on. So it's really valuing that very early experience of children's lives and making that piece count, because that itself counts, not because of its future cost. But I think the other kind of really strong argument for prevention and early is the moral argument, is that this is the right thing to do, you know, and especially for children who experience intergenerational disadvantage. We have a moral obligation to support them and to give them every opportunity that any child would. And I suppose we all benefit from that. So I think there are a few different, there is a lot of focus on the economic argument. And I really do see how we connect from, say, prevention and early intervention, early children's lives, and say maybe the work that you're doing or that you see at kind of, you know, at the other side of it, you know, the costs of the criminal justice system and all of this. But I think there's some bits in between as well. Yeah. So that's prevention and early intervention for me.
Thank you.
And I think in that, Jane, if I'm going on a tangent a bit, the other thing about it all is that children themselves aren't necessarily responsible for their own, you know, one of the anti-words in our work is behaviour, you know. So in a way, children don't misbehave, and you know, they are the product of their environment, of their relationships and the structures around them. So you know, going back to Young Knocknaheeny, I suppose it's all about putting those kind of environments in place which support them. So whether it's the parents, the other service providers, or the community around them, it's not their own behaviour as such which is responsible for how they interact with the world. It's the relationships which support them and their environment. So how good is the quality of the home environment, the service environment, the schools, the playgrounds, the play environments, you know, all of these the cultural norms, these things are really important. So it's not about changing the child, it's all the pieces around the child which really matter.
I totally get you. I mean, I've learned an awful
Sorry,
lot. No. It's perfect, because there will be people who don't know any of this, you know, who might tune in hopefully and be swayed by your experience and your knowledge and your practice. I've gone to many an event held by Young Knocknaheeny, and I think it was actually when I was off on maternity leave with Aurora, maybe, or possibly, I can't remember, Luke, all a bit of a blur. But I went to a Young Knocknaheeny event where I heard Catherine Maguire speaking about infant development and infant mental health and brain architecture, and the evidence that was coming out of the Harvard Center for the Developing Child and toxic stress and adverse childhood experiences. And what I think is interesting about your work is that you bring the adverse childhood experiences stuff together with social determinants of health. So it's the family environment plus the wider community environment and deprivation and housing issues and homelessness. Can you tell me a little bit about what is infant mental health? Because it's one of the key pieces of work that you guys do, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it forms the framework for the whole programme, and I can talk about the programme in a minute. And so it gives us our kind of our academic base, I suppose, for want of a better term in human services, which isn't a good term, but anyway. It also helps us to deliver some services as well. So I'm not the expert in infant mental health. As I said, I'm a kind of a community practitioner as such. But I suppose if I have a little definition here of what infant mental health is.
Yeah.
And it comes from the 0 to 3 Foundation in the US, where a lot of this work was first developed, which has then transferred. And you have to remember, though, that in the States where a lot of this comes from, there's a very different kind of welfare and health system. So here we have a very different context. We do have a very good, I suppose, universal health provision, welfare state, you know, education system as such. So we bring all that into this context. But anyway, 0 to 3 say that infant mental health is the capacity of a child to, from birth to 5, to experience, express and regulate emotions, form close and secure relationships, to explore their environments and learn. And I suppose what that means for me is we recognise their tiny little brains, like babies' tiny brains that are wired from the get-go, I suppose, to form those relationships, to attach to somebody else, to another, to help them to become, I suppose, emotionally and physically developed and developing, that helps them later in life to cope with the world around them, to regulate their emotions, to cope with stresses. It's not to avoid these things, it's to help them from the very beginning to learn how to adapt to the world around them. And I don't know who was it, you'll know this more than me, Jane. So a baby isn't a baby on its own, it's with another.
Yeah, the
Winnicott.
It's in the end, that the interaction is in the end, yeah. So and daddy or whoever. Yeah,
so bringing it back to that, infant mental health is all about the relationship that a child has from very early on into the world around them, and the importance of that relationship. And so in Young Knocknaheeny, to have that opportunity to bring that kind of I suppose, a psychosocial model, I suppose, if you want to put it that way. So you're looking at kind of community capacity, community development, social cohesion, with a kind of infant mental health framework to support that. I mean, it's a great opportunity, really. And you talk, I'm very much of the school of, I suppose, I've learned my background is around health inequalities and looking at the social model of health. And then you have adverse childhood experiences and trauma-informed approaches. And that's really bringing two parts of the world together, which are they're all from the same issues, really, but they're just bringing language and approaches together, I think, which are very cohesive, actually. And I think we need to pay attention to both all of the time, because there's the wider structural, that environment of children, and then there's the interpersonal relationships which play out, which are also needed for children as well. So it's both. Yeah.
Well, just in terms of the community that Knocknaheeny is, with intergenerational, say, unemployment and the stresses that the economic instability alone can have on a person, and then you add in all these other complex factors, there's only so much that we can kind of comfortably cope with on our own without supports, any of us.
Yeah.
Do you think that the state gets the importance of prevention and early intervention, and has adequately invested in it up until now?
Yeah, well, I mean, our name kind of makes us focus on Knocknaheeny, but you know, we work with a large number of communities in Cork, and we work with partners across the country as well. And but if you look at any government strategy, whether it's criminal justice, from the Department of Children, health, sláinte care, it all talks about prevention and early intervention. So actually, somewhere along the line, people do get it, policy does get it, it's written, it's everywhere, it's accepted at that level. I think the case has been made and won at that level. I think the issue is, how do you translate that into practice? And I suppose our programme gives some kind of an example of how you might do that, how you translate it all back down, how you bring government investment into a community, and you know, make it work, I suppose. And of course, I'm biased, I would say that there isn't enough investment in prevention and early intervention, and I think I forget the resource, but I've seen some sort of comparisons across Europe, let's say, of where who's investing in what at what points in Ireland. And in Ireland, we have a kind of we invest this much from birth all the way along to late adulthood. And in countries where outcomes are better for everybody, there's a big spike at the beginning of life. There might be another spike around, you know, teenage years, which is another critical period of development. And then you continue on at certain kind of key moments in people's lives. And I suppose it's that critical investment here, which we haven't fully got yet, I think. So more does need to be done, and it's not for the benefit of just those people in those communities. It will enhance everything, that, you know, mainstream service provision, as well as sort of unique little models of practice that work well in particular pockets of the country. So no is the answer to your question, that
On investment,
not enough is invested. And I don't think that is necessarily taking it away from anywhere else. I don't think that's the argument. I don't think that's it either. I think there needs to be some shifts towards prevention and early intervention, and at some point somebody's got to make a decision to say, right, we're not going to front load into crisis intervention. We're actually going to take a longer view and reorientate towards prevention and early intervention. And I suppose that some of that does need to take place, but there needs to be overall more investment as well. And the other thing about prevention, early intervention, which probably I didn't say earlier, is has an evidence base. You know, we know what works. We have to apply what works, choose it and stick with it and implement it, you know. I think that's really important. Sorry, you were saying
Yeah,
something
no problem. And do you think the barrier to greater investment is because of the electoral cycle, and that, you know, prevention and early intervention services are competing with big, massive, expensive things like the health budget, or, you know, so what we hear about people on trolleys or whatever else, or right now housing, or is it a case of failing to see the dots between the fact that, you know, if children are in homeless accommodation for a prolonged period or in direct provision, it'll have an impact on learning ability and possibly behavioral stuff, you know, and health and yada, yada, yada down the line. What do you think the hold up actually is with just making the money available?
Like, there is political cycles, obviously. So there is a constraint there. I think the other thing is that in Ireland, you know, is actually held up as a country where we have sort of paid attention to early intervention and prevention, but maybe not at the community level as such yet. And really, the work has been in train for maybe 15 years. Clearly, prevention and early intervention needs to happen across budgetary cycles. That's, you know, that's a no-brainer. But I mean, that's not just prevention and early, you know, that's so many services need that kind of more longer term opportunity to think on the longer term, and to be supported. When our program was first set up, it was over 3 years. You wouldn't believe the level of comfort that provides. And that's short, you know.
When you're delivering services with such heart and commitment, and not actually then knowing, will we survive, you know, okay, 3 years was something, but if it's year on year funding and people are going, will we be here next year? That's actually very unhelpful for everyone and unhelpful in terms of safety.
And I suppose we went through a little bit of that when the 3 years was up. But actually now, you know, there has been a commitment to our programs on a kind of more national basis, on a mainstream basis. We don't know what the future holds. And of course, obviously the current crisis kind of, you know, it's the crisis end that really counts. There's children in care at the moment. There's children, you know, who need the support of child protection services. There's people needing hospital care and all the rest of it. Of course, priorities are going to be taken and decisions have to be taken. And some of the, maybe, I don't know, we've been, you know, all the kind of guarantees have been put in place and the assurances that things will be looked after and guaranteed in the future. But, you know, prevention and early intervention, or the kind of more softer measures, you know, are probably a little bit more vulnerable. And especially when there are, you know, in the previous general election, you were looking at the trolley crisis, the housing crisis. These, you know, they are crises and they do need to be responded to. But there's an under layer of things that need to be addressed on a much longer term as well. I think housing and prevention, early intervention are one of the same, really. They fit in the same picture.
On the housing issue, I asked Nikki Egan this, and also Colette Kelleher, you know, that was an ongoing crisis, having record numbers of families and children living in B&Bs or hotels, unsuitable accommodation hubs, the like, as well as direct provision. And there were constant clamorings from NGOs and people such as yourselves, I'm sure, about how we needed to stop this, that we needed, to provide homes for people, safe, secure homes. And we were met with the constant refrain, we can't do that, we can't freeze rents, we can't stop evictions, this constitutional rights to property that we can't mess with. And boom, we had a different crisis, a public health crisis. We couldn't have more homeless people on the streets. And they managed to find out that actually, within a very short period of time, something could be done. So do we just really need to try and harness will to do this, to see that childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences, matters to do with the social determinants of health are public health issues and ongoing public health issues that need to be tackled?
Well, yes, and I think that children growing up in any kind of housing insecurity is going to have a long-term impact on their health. So of course that's a public health issue. That's, they go hand in hand. And I suppose my own view is that the housing issue for children is much wider than, I think, 4,000, I can't remember the figures now, children in housing emergency accommodation. There is housing instability and unsuitable housing for children much more commonplace than we have accounted for. And this has been going on for much longer than the few years, I think, and will take a long time to address as well. And we see where housing impacts the housing situation, the insecurity or the unsuitable housing impacts on relationships, it impacts on children's physical and mental well-being and development, it impacts on their capacity to engage in normal social and educational learning opportunities. All of those things, if you look at the social model of health, impact on health, and so are a public health issue because there is a much longer term impact and a much wider societal impact on that. So I think maybe one of the things that needs to come out of this is to really think about all of our efforts in a public health context. Maybe we should try that a little bit, but I think that is going back, because if you look at if you look at the social model of health, it's all there. If you study the Marmot stuff, Sir Michael Marmot, so this is all about health inequalities and the cost of that morally and to society. So I don't think we're not that far from making those cases, because those cases have been made before. I think it's maybe giving it a new context or a new platform, and making that case for in the public health context. I haven't really thought about this until you asked me now, but there is a way of reframing that, I think, now, and it might be timely to do that. Yeah.
And I think across sectors as well, so the early years make it, education makes it, health and housing, criminal justice, that actually all of these, like violence is a public health issue, domestic violence is a public health issue. And so, Katherine, I know that you've engaged with the policy making process at various points, including locally, I believe, in a report on housing. Is that right? Am I correct about that?
Yeah, I mean, we've done a few different things. I suppose what goes alongside the programme is the kind of research and documenting element of it. Last year we did a piece around looking at our own information on the experiences of family around housing issues, and the impact that was having on children, and ongoing advocacy pieces that we have to support children to have a really good quality home environment, secure home environment. And then another piece we've done is around an evaluation of the whole programme, I suppose, and its impact. And another piece we've done is around children's voices, and inclusion of children's voices in the work and the decision making and the processes that we have. So I suppose the kind of what I take from our involvement in this side of the house, the kind of documenting piece, is the importance of not my voice. It's really not my experience, really. So you can't argue with people and their own experiences. It's their lived experience. And I think that we did a lovely piece of work last year around the voices of very young children, pre-verbal children, or
Wow.
children who weren't developed, they weren't communicating in a kind of an oral way, but we were able to understand their voice and their perspective and their agency, and the same for the housing report. It wasn't from our perspective. It started off that way, what practitioners were coming back and telling us and how the difficulties, but in the end it was about going back to the families and asking their perspective on things. So it wasn't really from us, and I think that some of that's been very well received at departmental and at level and at local level, because we're the conduit for other people to have their voice, and I think that's been very important, and it kind of makes it a little bit more meaningful, I suppose. And that's not taken away from our own work, our own team's experience, because that's really important too. But obviously we have to include the people who we're all about. We wouldn't be here without the community and the people that voluntarily engage with our programme. There's nothing in our programme which anyone has to or is compelled to or obliged to engage with us.
Yeah, it's not done through them. It's alongside.
And it's through the relationship. It's an invitation for a relationship, really, and we build on that. And we have evidence-based programs and all of that, but it doesn't happen if people don't want to engage with it. So, we're meeting families in the pregnancy period. We're meeting families in public health nursing development clinics to talk about communication. We visit people in their homes. People open their doors to us, and we work with them around developmental guidance, around child development, emotional support, relational support, that kind of thing. We also invite practitioners to engage with us, so we do loads of training for other services in infant mental health, and that's by invitation as well. We're just trying to, I suppose, in the most sort of modest way, in a way, is to invite people to engage in a different way of thinking and a different way of working. And I think that has some integrity to it, which then can help to inform policy. So you're gathering all of that up, you're documenting that, and you're giving it back in a way that you hope will make sense to somebody and will be able to respond. So yeah, I mean, we haven't done a huge amount of kind of policy or advocacy work at a kind of very, there are other bigger agencies involved in that than ourselves, but I think joining forces with others as well is very important, because again, maybe it's that local context which is very important, and we can contribute some of that, or help to contribute some of that as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about how the families, let's say, or the children, or whoever it was that you spoke to in the report on housing issues, how do they feel about, when the report was published and their words were there on the page and people were reading them and hearing them, and like having maybe felt voiceless and powerless and unable to control their situation, at least someone was listening to them? Did they feel that way?
Yeah, I think there is a bit of that, and the thing is that the report we did, aligned with reports that the Children's Ombudsman did, that the Joint Oireachtas, the Housing Committee and the Children's Committee did. I think there was Novas in Limerick as well, and the Royal College of Physicians did a same piece. So the impact is so focusing on the impact of children. So really you're creating an opportunity for that very individual voice to be part of a collective voice, you know. And of course it's difficult for us all to put ourselves forward, but I think once you're part of the bigger picture, then I think that helps as well. You know, it's not it's in the numbers.
You feel so alone,
as
maybe,
such,
as well. As
maybe.
Yeah, when you come together. What was I going to ask you there in terms of, sorry, now I've lost my train of thought. It was in relation to kind of being engaged with various committees or departments. I presume your main department would be the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, or would you also engage with the Housing Department and the Department of Education? Does it kind of in various ways?
Yeah, I mean, we've been mainstreamed under a state agency, so it's not, you know, it's through all the normal effective channels, really. I think it's very important if other organisations, you know, you need to document everything, and you need to share it. So Jane, you're the expert of that, but like, you know, providing that information to organisations, other organisations, and to government departments. So say, for example, when we're doing a piece of work, I think you would say to me, right, send it to absolutely everybody. You know, everybody needs to hear this across departments, across sectors, and, you know, maybe that's the way to go. And you do get a response, in fairness, to everybody. You know, so it is important to share what you have learned and to share that with other people, and to accept that it's a learning process as well for everybody. There's nobody in public service, in government, in local organisations, local authorities, who are not in it for the right reason. You know what I mean? Everybody goes into this work with the right reasons. Of course they do.
And that's such an important point to make, I think, to be fair to people.
And the other thing is that it's not about fighting a system here either, Jane. I've seen amazing collaborations. I've seen huge development and progress made, you know, in our own programme, mainstreaming, all that sort of thing. Like, it is change. If I actually sat down and notched off the little wins that have happened, or the little progresses that have been made for children in our, you know, in Ireland, in the community or whatever, like, it has happened. Things have moved, you know, here significantly in the last number of years. There's still a huge amount to do, but you know, and there's difficulties in doing that, but, you know, I think there is, it's just finding the right doors, really.
Sure. One thing that Colette was saying as well is that it's very important to treasure those incremental wins, because if you only have the let's have the revolution now and upend the entire system, you know, and pour every penny into prevention and early intervention, you're going to be disappointed. Whereas you have to bring people along, you know, persuade, build relationships, even with people who aren't natural allies, and then celebrate the wins and not be despondent when homelessness isn't eradicated overnight, you know, but to keep on plugging in there all the same. Katherine, in terms of this COVID-19 crisis and the pandemic and the fact that you're at home when you'd normally be in the office, I'm sitting on the floor outside the bathroom for a change of location, and that's a bit new too. But people are working under very different conditions. Your frontline people who'd be visiting homes can't do that right now. Can you tell me about the work that you are able to do with children and families right now, and how concerned are you about us reaching the most vulnerable?
Yeah, I mean, we have had to adapt really quickly. And at first, you're just wondering when you're told you can't travel, for example, or we shouldn't travel. We are deemed an essential service, so people do travel if they need to travel. But we moved to a telehealth model, and everybody is working from home generally. There's obviously some practical assistance that some families do need, but on the whole, we're very available to families over the phone and through WhatsApp videoing and all that kind of thing. And people have been incredibly responsive to it and grateful for it, and sort of efficient with it as well. Now, obviously, not being in a home, you don't see the full. Sometimes you worry you don't see the full situation, or you don't have a full understanding of the situation, or how you might be able to help, or how certain members of the family might be coping. But you know, what we are able to offer is actually much more effective than even I thought it would be. And also, because we're not able to do some of the other areas of work that we would normally be involved in, we can't run our groups. So
Nice.
it's a bit heartbreaking, I think, for the team, but we normally run baby massage.
Oh, lovely.
A group that's from Oxford, actually, PEEPS, which is the infant and parent group around the parent as the sort of educator in their child's life, the primary educator, and their role. And the other thing is it's called Let's Talk with Your Baby. So it's promoting early language and communication development. I'm probably missing one, but anyway, there's a range of groups, and we can't run those at the moment. And some of them would say you shouldn't really be doing them online. You know, they're very much interactive kind of groups. So we weren't able to do those, so we sort of reorganized our time. So now we're actually able to do a good bit more now on the one-to-one home visiting model, but from our own homes.
Yeah.
And it's been great. Like, we're probably working with around about 120 families directly. And then there's a whole load of other families that we just sort of check in with from time to time. There's probably another couple of hundred families there that would normally connect in with us through the groups or for other reasons. So we're doing a sort of a check-in and then a more intensive piece of work with some families. And I suppose the existing issues remain. So housing is, you know, family income, you know, these are all relationships, challenging relationships, and that, but these are all pre-existing kind of ongoing difficulties for families that you now present a whole other crisis on top of, which is which makes it very difficult for some families to implement the national guidelines. So, you know, if you're in an overcrowded house, or you have multiple generations in one house, how do you limit your interactions or enforce? We're all health and safety enforcers now in our own homes, but how do you do that in an overcrowded household? Or in a house, or, you know, when you think about some families, say traveller families or families in direct provision, you know, it's very difficult for them. Or if you think about all the panic buying that went on a few weeks ago, and hopefully it's kind of settled now, but if I'm a single parent and I can only get out of the house once a week to do my shopping, and I go to the supermarket and there's no nappies on the shelf, or whatever, what do? I don't really, you know. So there are some practical kind of knock-on effects to this that I think, but then I have to say that there's also a huge amount of resilience, a collective effort going on, and it's been really quite inspiring at community level. So while I'm saying all of those things, I don't mean to say it in a negative way that doesn't acknowledge what is also working really well and what families do to make things work for themselves. It's really quite incredible, and we find a lot of families are doing pretty well, thank you, and they need and isn't it difficult for us all? We're all parents now, we're all educators, we're, you know, all of this, and so it's nice to acknowledge where people are doing well, you know. And support where we can, if it's helpful.
It's very interesting that the WhatsApp video calls and the check-ins are going down well. Bruce Perry on the Trauma Therapist podcast was saying what's very important is the dosage of meaningful interactions, and that it doesn't have to be terribly long, but just checking in with people and kind of telling them, you know, I'm thinking about you and hoping you're well, that does mean something to people.
Yeah, I think for us it's about the relationship, really. I love that word. We came across that word a couple of years ago, dosage. So, you know, the amount of the frequency of which and the quality of that interaction is really important. So for some families, they might need short check-ins a couple of times a week. Another family set aside an hour to speak to you once a week. You know, that's the difference. But so it's really led by people themselves to tell us what they need. But I do think this will change the way we all work going forward, no matter what the short-term response has been. I do think it will check, you know, we're going to have to live with COVID for a very long time into the future. So this isn't just a kind of crisis response. I think we will change the way we work and interact in the future, that needs to sort of hold on to the relationships and the connections, but there might be a different way we approach that in the future. And I suppose we have to be open to that.
Yeah. Stephen Porridges as well, the guy who developed polyvagal theory. I was watching a podcast that he did about COVID, and he was saying the face-to-face video stuff is really good, especially for people who are on their own, or say people who don't have many other connections, supportive family who they can see, because just seeing someone's face sort of activates the social engagement system and the face-heart connection, seeing people's eyes, and the voice is also really important, which I thought was interesting. But going forward, Katherine, you mentioned there that COVID isn't going to disappear overnight, which of course it's not. We've no idea how long this will linger, not only linger, but, you know, dictate everything really, and dictate our lives and ability to work. Once things do calm down or abate somewhat, and policymakers and politicians can start to think about something else again other than the pandemic, what do you hope they might focus on for children and families?
Well, I think you've got to listen to people like Sean Healy and people like Tanya Ward. You know, we need a new social contract, and I really like that concept. I think that's really important. And I think there's been huge efforts, very inspiring leadership at all different levels around responding to this. And I think we have to take that into the long term. But it needs to be in partnership and much more direct, I suppose, democracy that supports, gives people agency. You know, and I think that being able to do, say, for example, the housing policies that you've talked about, so evictions or whatever it is, rent freezes, you know, that it shows what's possible, I suppose.
When the will is there.
Yeah, and you know, there is a cost to all of this. All prevention and early intervention, by the way, does cost money. You don't need to steal it from somewhere else to put it into the pot. It needs its own investment. And I suppose I would like to see a kind of a shift towards that kind of social contract that I think has been missing for a little while. But that's not, you know, even the people that are in at the moment, it is possible to do this with the existing structures that we have, because it's being shown after the last few weeks that we're able to do it, you know.
Yes.
So
And
I think we'll...
Sorry, Katherine, are you encouraged then by the fact that many people have rallied really under these extreme conditions and you know, volunteered to do X, Y, or Z? You know, they might have been laid off and they've signed up for the emergency work in social care, let's say, or manning receptions, whatever is within their abilities and skill set, or doctors returning to work, you know, elderly people who've retired and going back into the HSC. Do you think this might be hopefully a defining moment where we've woken up to the fact that really we are all in it together, and that we are all vulnerable, and we benefit from supporting our most vulnerable members?
Yes, I do. Like the optimist in me, which I am, says that all that is there. But I think it's always been there. I have to say, like, you know, I'm not from this jurisdiction, obviously, but I've been here practically my whole adult life. And what strikes me always in Ireland is the capacity of we're not just compliant. I suppose we have shown ourselves to be fairly compliant in this situation, but the willingness for people to step up and in is incredible. That was always there before, I think. You know, you look at sports organisations and community organisations were all propped up by volunteers, school boards, voluntary contribute. You know, we all participate in our own way. But I think what this might allow us to do, and I'm talking off the top of my head really here, but to have a bit more flexibility, you know, so
right. Within our work,
if it is that within our work, within when we retire, when we think our contribution is up or not, or where we could make a different contribution, that there is capacity within the system to allow us to make those contributions. You know, I think that's all really important. I think cross-sectoral learning is obviously very important too, so that I can benefit from a different way of thinking or learning, or doing that maybe hasn't been there before, you know. But it has been inspiring to see how people have moved into position to step up. I think that's been incredible. So I think if that's possible now, why not? Why not?
Exactly.
And you know, if you want to bring it back to children, well, put them as, think about what their agency in that as well, because obviously it's those children that are very quickly the next generation. You know, I've seen the generations move through in my own work already, and quite quickly they're able to, you know, they do contribute to policy and practice, and I think we need to give it over a little bit to them. You know, voting age, you look at the climate crisis, we need to come back to that, you know, and children's voice in that was so critical. And I think we need to not lose sight of all of that now. But harness it really.
So kind of harness children's capacity for kindness, compassion, and activism. More than it is already, kind of, as you say, with Greta and the youngsters leading the climate change movement. So perfect sense. Katherine Harford, thank you so much for talking to me. It's been fascinating discussion, and thank you and your colleagues for the wonderful work that you do in Young Knocknaheeny. I'm a massive fan of the work there. It's truly inspiring, and thank you for your insights on how to talk policy and influence people, or giving ideas to policymakers present and future on what to maybe focus on and who to have in the room and whose voices to listen to. It's been great. Thanks.
I'm not sure if I answered any of your policy questions, but you certainly gave me a very large space to tell you my
Yeah, no, it was
perspectives.
fantastic. Thanks, Katherine. It was a
Thanks,
pleasure.
Jane.
Thank you.